Hi everyone, warm welcome to you for this July webinar with BCS Agile Methods Specialist Group. I'm your host for the session, Sathpal Singh, and some of you might know me from previous sessions. I'm the chair of the BCS Agile Methods, joined by a number of our committee members as well, part of the team. So Ahmad's here, Ahmad's our treasurer. Won't be able to see anyone now, I think, but if Ahmad, you're there, you're off your video, give everyone a wave. We've got David, inclusion officer, and also Martin. Sorry, Martin's our inclusion officer. David's our diversity. No, I've got that wrong. Martin's our early careers advocate, and David's our inclusions officer. So that's all the kind of officers in the committee. But great to have you here. Thank you for joining us for the session. We're really looking forward to it. It's going to be another great one, very informative. Before I introduce our speaker, just the normal simple formalities. We just encourage everyone to be respectful. That's as far as we go with our code of conduct. I want everyone to have a great experience. Michael will take some questions at the end. We'll have plenty of time. It's a 90-minute session, so we will facilitate that later in the session, and we will finish with any updates and announcements we have. And if anybody in the group has any of their own, we're happy for you to share them with this group. And with that, I'm thrilled to welcome Michael Lloyd to the session. Michael's we know Michael's work because he's very active online. Our paths have crossed on the speaker circuit, although we were both at Agile Manchester as speakers, but sadly we didn't get a chance to chat. So we were joking about that before we went live. So Michael's here because he's not only the founder of Honest Agile and does a lot of work in the global agility space, but he's also the creator of Dysfunction Mapping, which I've been excited to learn about for quite some time. So we're really pleased that he's joining us for this session, and looking forward to learning more about how it works and how it can be applied to support us in our endeavours for greater agility. So without further ado, welcome, Michael. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, mate. So yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you all for coming. The first thing I'm going to do is try and share my screen, because that's usually the first thing that'll break when I try to push the wrong button. How's that looking? Everyone see my slide there? Brill. So the other thing I would love, so I know that a lot of people don't like being on camera, but if anyone is willing to turn on the camera that doesn't have it on currently, I would love that. I'll be honest, that's just mainly because I do tell the occasional rubbish joke throughout, and being able to see just how much they annoy people helps me to, further refine them for future talks. So just being able to see some faces is great. But if you don't want to have your cameras on, that's fine too. Yeah, cool. So hi, I'm Mike. I won't bore you with all my background, but the short version is I'm an Agile coach. I've been helping teams and organizations with this whole Agile value delivery thing for many years. And my passion at the moment is really trying to counteract some of the what we might call anti-patterns, some of the problems that have been seeping into the Agile space, or maybe have always been here. And dysfunction mapping is one of the main ways that I'm doing that, which is a tool that really just tries to pull together all the stuff that I've learned over the years as an Agile coach, as a Scrum Master, and more than anything, just takes all the mistakes that I've made and then kind of forms them up in a way that prevents me from making them again. And now I teach that to other people in the hope that we can kind of raise the bar a little bit and hopefully improve Agile practice around the world. So I'll get straight into it, I guess, because I've got a slide that I like to open with that always is an eyebrow raiser. Who's been hearing this one lately? Agile is dead. Has anyone else spend as much time on LinkedIn as I do? Yeah, I can see a couple of thumbs up. You can probably guess from the way that I've attributed this quote that I don't quite believe it myself. But it's really interesting, right? I think there's something very fascinating about the fact that this has become, it seems like a very, very common topic on the kind of Agile social media sphere, right? My question, I guess, is what does that tell us? And it's something I'd encourage you to think about as we sort of go through these slides. I will have a few points where I'll ask you some questions and ask you to put some stuff in the chat, but you're more than welcome to kind of contribute to the chat as we go, or kind of keep an eye on it. And then at the very end, we'll have a proper Q&A session. So obviously we can address anything that I don't cover. But like I said, the reason I'm finding this interesting is because I'm a systems thinker, right? I like to think about, the systems that we work in, the way that we solve problems, and how do things connect. And to me, the fact that lots of people lately have been saying this statement or some variation of it is what I like to call a symptom, right? And I'm going to use this language a lot as we go. It tells us that there's something wrong. It's not necessarily the correct description of the problem, but the fact that it's happening at all tells us that something is going on here that we want to talk about, right? And so that kind of leads to maybe a bunch of other questions. But for me, it causes me to look around and see, well, what's going on in the industry? Why might people be saying this? And I think one of the places where you can kind of see the obviousness of where this might come from is the layoffs, right? There's a lot of layoffs happening in the tech industry. You can see some numbers on screen to put it in context. And just in the 30 minutes that I run through these slides, another 16 people somewhere in the tech industry are going to have been laid off. And I don't know about you all, but it feels a little bit like these are disproportionately affecting agile type or agile support roles, right? That's a bit anecdotal. Maybe I'm wrong, but it certainly feels like I'm seeing more of that. Yeah, I can see some nods in the video there. So again, like why is that? What's happening? Does that tell us maybe that there is some perceived lack of value in agile and agile support roles? Maybe, right? And so again, you keep digging. And the other thing that I keep seeing is I'm applying for jobs right now, right? I don't have a full-time job. I've been looking at the market. And actually the pay on offer is often a lot lower than I would have expected to have seen this time last year. And when you look into the numbers, yeah, actually there's been about a 10% drop in the average pay for Scrum Masters since this time last year. And that it literally is a direct correlation, right? How valuable is our role perceived as being? And if that drops, there's something happening there. What could be causing that? And then the last one, just before I'm done scaring you, this one I just found fascinating when I found these numbers. The actual number of Scrum Master job listings is at its lowest in a very long time. So not only do we have fewer Scrum Master job listings today compared to in the middle of the pandemic, which is crazy enough on its own, but actually it's lower than even it was since any time from 2011 onwards. And just to really put that in context, the first official Scrum guide wasn't published until 2010. And we currently have fewer Scrum Master job listings than any time since 2011. So again, it tells you something, right? You can draw your own conclusions, but it says something about the perceived value of Scrum Masters. And I know a lot of people are probably on this call thinking, well, I'm not a Scrum Master. What do I care, right? But the thing I would encourage you to think about is Scrum Masters are arguably at the vanguard of the Agile movement. They're kind of the people at the front, right? And if the perceived value of Scrum Masters is on the decline, it says something about Agile practice, or at least Scrum practice as a whole. And again, this just raises more questions for me around, why are people perceiving that value to be lower now than before? And that kind of leads to my first question for you all. I'd love to maybe get some thoughts in the chat. Why do you think the perceived value of agile practitioners might be on the decline? I can see someone's already beaten me to the punch because David's put in there the only thing that it tells me is that people have very fixed ideas about what agile might be, which is definitely true, something that I can recognize. But what else do you think could be going on? Why do you think that agile practitioners might not be seen as valuable, at least as much now as they were a few years ago? Yeah, I can see Louise has said, we think we've already implemented it. Think is an important word I can see in that sentence. Yeah, loads of companies that are just selling courses, learn Scrum in 5 days, right? That's certainly going to be a big contributing factor. Not as much return on investment. Yeah, I've been in a lot of organizations that have spent a lot of money on agile transformation that just hasn't panned out really, right? And they implement it wrong. Yeah, Belinda, good point. General skills are perceived to be higher, so we're not needed. That's definitely a big one, right? And whether that's accurate or not is its own question. But again, definitely an interesting insight. Mashup of agile sold by SAFe, right? Business reputation, don't do estimates. Yeah, so I'd encourage you to keep adding stuff there. I'd love to see what other thoughts you come up with. But I guess the point here is I don't necessarily know either, right? But as someone who's been in this industry now for nearly 10 years, I've been looking around and kind of drawing some of my own conclusions about what might have led us here. And I've got a few things that I'd like to mention, and that will then lead us into, what I'm actually here to talk about, which is how we might start beating some of this stuff. So first thing that I think makes a big impact, and people have mentioned this in the chat, is this problem with the way that we train and particularly certify practitioners, right? And this number that's on screen, this pie chart here, it illustrates a lot in my view, because if you look at the total number of people that have a PSM1 certification from scrum.org, it's about 600,000 people. So a lot of people that have that entry-level Intro to Scrum certification. But when you look at the number of people with a PSM2, which I think is about 30, 40,000 people, it's less than 1% of that total. It's a significantly lower number of people that have taken the jump from PSM1 to PSM2. And PSM3, which is the one that I have, that's 0.01% of the people with a certification at all from scrum.org that go up to get that one. And that represents that little tiny red line that's on the pie chart. And the funny part is I actually had to fake this pie chart and draw the red line in because it was such a small fraction that it actually was not visible on the pie chart by default. So again, it tells you that a lot of people are not going for these high level certifications. And I'm not here to tell you that certifications really matter that much. I'm not here to say that these are the thing that make for good agile practitioners. But for me, the fact that so many people get that intro to 2-day and nothing else, and we have so few people going up into those extra certifications, ones who've already bought into certifications to some degree, again, it tells us something about where our focus is as an industry and as a community, right? What we're trying to train and what we're not training, which I think could be a big contributing factor. And then when you add that into the framework wars, right, I'm sure everyone kind of immediately knows what I mean and probably has examples that pop into mind. Yeah, I can see some smiles and nods. God, all we ever seem to do is just fight over Scrum this and Safe that and Kanban whatever, right? And my view of it is, who cares? Like, who cares what framework you're using? Who cares what tool you're using? Do you get results? Oh, actually, wait a minute. On second thought, maybe don't answer that because that kind of leads into the next problem, right? Which is, do we get results? Like it really feels like sometimes we're very, very bad at demonstrating actual positive outcomes as a result of like agile change or coaching, this sort of thing. And yeah, I know we've all heard these stories about, velocity and story points being abused, and there's lots of reasons why we might not want to measure certain things. But often when I talk to Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, and I'm like, tell me how you measure your success. Tell me how you know that you're a good, return on investment for your company. And often the answer that I get is maybe one step above, just trust me, bro, which doesn't inspire a great deal of confidence. And so again, it leads to this question, right, of like, what are we doing as an industry, as a community, and how might we make things better? Which leads to this kind of the most incendiary frame that I have in this slide pack. And we'll see what you all think about it. It would be easy in the face of all this stuff I've just talked about, to conclude that the average Scrum Master isn't competent. And I can certainly tell you that when I've been hiring for Scrum Master positions, I've been trying to fill those roles. 9 out of 10 Scrum Masters that I talk to, that their CVs come on my desk, 9 out of 10 of them don't seem to have a basic grasp of Scrum. They don't seem to be able to demonstrate any real measurable outcomes. And I could see why, if that was your only view into the Agile community, if those were the people you were talking to, you would draw some pretty damning conclusions. And I want to be absolutely clear with this one, because it is a bit of an unfair slide, this. I'm not trying to blame the individual Scrum Masters, right? This is a result of that lack of training and support that I mentioned earlier. It's the bad conversations that we're having about frameworks instead of the stuff that matters, that leads to a lot of Scrum Masters getting 2 days of training, getting thrown into a dysfunctional organization, and then being given no further support to actually figure out how to do the job properly, right? How to be effective. Systems inhibiting competence, David has just said. Could not phrase it better myself. And so the question that obviously just arises from that then is, well, how do we solve that problem, right? What do we do to try to give Scrum Masters and just Agile practitioners generally a better chance at being successful at this stuff? And as you can probably guess, I've got a potential solution for you. It always sounds a little bit like I'm selling something, so please promise, wait until the end, and I'll tell you about how you don't actually need to spend any money to do this. But I'm not here to try to sell you a silver bullet. I'm not, going to give you all the answers. What I am trying to do is pull together all the stuff that I've learned from these years of getting it wrong, all of the different experiences that I've had, and try to give something back to the Agile community that might move the needle on those things, right? That maybe makes it a bit easier for people to solve the problems that actually matter, and importantly, to demonstrate that they've actually had an impact. And that, of course, is dysfunction mapping. As you can see, it's basically just stickies on a whiteboard. There's nothing particularly magic about it. But what we're going to do is I'm going to talk through how this process works at a super high level. Like I say, you're not going to have time to really deeply understand it. So please, think about your questions as we go. And at the end, we will talk about those. But for now, I will go through, how it works, why it works, and kind of some of the things that relate to it. Before that, though, I guess I like to start with another question for you all to think about, which is, what are some of the challenges to either creating or sustaining change as an agile practitioner, as a leader, as a coach, whatever your context is, I guess. And again, just chuck some stuff in the chat. What do you think are some of the challenges to creating or sustaining that change? See, Amy has said organizational inertia. Louise has framed it as moving people's heads. Corporate culture is a big one for sure. What else makes it hard? Willingness to change. Yeah, that's a big one. Focus on individuals and teams, not teams in systems. That is beautifully phrased, and that is something I'm definitely going to come back to. Leadership skepticism. Yeah, that's a big part of it, especially when we get back to that inability to demonstrate results, right? Fear. Yeah, that's a big one. Nice. So as before, like feel free to keep adding stuff. I'd love to see what else pops up here as we go. Yeah, managers who think if they say agile often enough, things will change. Turns out it doesn't quite do it. So yeah, keep adding stuff. Like I say, we don't have time to spend too much on that, but I will take questions at the end as well, so we can talk about some of this if you've got different ideas or inputs. Like I say, the reason I asked this question though is because I've now worked with, done workshops and talks and all sorts of meetups at this point with thousands of agile practitioners across different countries and industries. And I always ask some version of this question to get this sense of, what is it that makes the job hard for people? And the interesting thing is, I just keep seeing the same patterns coming up over and over and over again. It's the same basic things that people struggle with. No surprise, really, right? I'm sure we all kind of feel that in our bones to some degree. But what I've tried to do is kind of distill them down, summarize them to these 6 key themes, which is what I've started terming the 6 killers of change. You can see them on screen. I won't read through them, but like I say, these are not an exhaustive list. They certainly don't perfectly capture everything. But what I found is that these are the things that seem to keep coming up. And by keeping these in mind when we talk about solving problems, it maybe makes it a little bit easier to get to where you need to be. And so what I'm now going to do is essentially talk through each of these 6 killers of change and how they're a problem, and then in particular introduce dysfunction mapping as an approach, and how each of its steps is sort of built to address each of these challenges, each of these killers. It's a bit of an imperfect mapping, so some things do apply in multiple places, but it's just a way to kind of talk it through essentially. And again, please do ask questions that we can come back to or think about them until the end. So I'm going to start with this one that I call low trust. And I'm sure we've all experienced this, right? Low trust is that little devil that sits on your shoulder and, says, no, don't listen to him. He's just trying to manipulate you. He just wants to trick you, right? This is the natural outcome of people that have been through really bad, like change plans or transformations in the past, right? Because when you've had a scrum master or a coach that has just tried to manipulate you or tried to force a new way of working on you, you will become quite skeptical. And if you've seen 5 different frameworks being installed in your business, you're naturally going to start getting a little bit of a shell that makes you not want to go along with some of this stuff. And that can make it really, really hard if you're a change agent, you're a scrum master, an agile coach trying to introduce some new ideas, because you now need to break through that. And often we don't account for that strongly enough, I find. And so this is why dysfunction mapping is an approach. It starts with a very, very simple step that is basically probably what you already do today if you're a change agent, which is look around, talk to people, ask questions, try and get a sense of what are the problems that people actually care about. And the question I often like to ask is, what is it that makes your life difficult? And the important thing here is we're not trying to start from, hey, I'm here to install Scrum, or I'm here to make you all better at doing your jobs because I know best. We're trying to anchor ourselves to what are the problems that the people around me in this organization actually care about? And by asking those questions and writing some stuff down, you can start to get a sense of maybe the places you might want to focus your efforts. And so what we do here in this step you can see on screen, building a funnel, is really just writing stuff on stickies, collecting it together so that we can look for those patterns. And we generally break it into these 3 sections that we call observation, conversation, and Gemba. I think the first 2 fairly obvious for most people. Does anyone know or not anyone have a guess at what Gemba means? If anyone knows it, wants to put in the chat what Gemba means. Yeah, David, go to the place. One way to put it. Workplace. Yeah. So it comes from lean. It's just the idea of like go to where the work is being done, right? And I really call this out now, particularly since COVID, with a lot more remote working. I find a lot of people end up getting quite far removed from the actual work being done. And so this is a reminder to actually just go to, where the teams are talking to people, that kind of thing. And like I say, all we're really doing at this stage is just collecting insights. What is it that's causing pain? You can see some examples on screen there. These are all very Scrum-like examples, just for the sake of simplicity, but this doesn't have to be Scrum related, right? This is anything and everything that potentially makes life hard for people. And so even that I have found is one of those things that is easier for me now because I've been doing it for 10 years than it sometimes is for newer agile practitioners. And so as part of the full workshop that I do, I've created these cards to kind of make this process a little bit easier, a bit more gamified. And you can see some examples of those on screen now. So, prompt cards like what is causing us pain, conversation cards like the daily scrum is a waste of time, which is a really great example of something that, I'm not going to make a judgment of whether that's true or not. But the fact that people are saying it is something that's interesting. It's information I can use, right? So that's something I might write down. And even observation cards like work is pushed onto the team mid-sprint, which is an example of something I might see as a Scrum Master, as a coach, that no one's going to complain to me about because they think, well, that's just how we do it, right? Like, of course, if a manager comes and says, hey, do this, I'm going to do it. That's just how we've always done it. But there are certain things that you in your expertise might note that you observe are potentially problems that others might not actually raise to you in a question. And so again, these cards are part of a larger deck that just help easily pull some ideas out as you build that funnel. But there's no right or wrong way to do this. This is just a place to collect your thoughts in its simplest form. And so that kind of leads us then into the next question, right? So I've potentially gathered some problems, but what do I do about that? And that's where we hit our next killer of change, which is the lack of buy-in. Because in my experience, a lack of buy-in usually means I've got more important things to do. It's a result of people that basically don't feel connected to the change that we're trying to, to bring in, to experiment with, because they don't really see the value of it. A phrase that I've heard a bunch that I really like is, I don't have time to mend the fence, I have to chase the cattle, which I feel like it really captures this mindset sometimes of I can't possibly do this thing to help you improve our work in progress limits and, maybe increase our focus because I'm just too busy with stuff. So actually the thing you need to do is help people understand why the change might help them. And that's why this next step in dysfunction mapping can be really important. So this is where we get to identifying groups of symptoms. So in our funnel, our things that we connected together, now we can start pulling things together that we think might be related and, for want of a better word, connecting the dots for people. And so this is, I find, a really great way to break through because you can do things like pull together 5 examples of a problem that 5 different people all thought just affected them. And now we put it on a wall and we realize, hey, actually, we're all being negatively impacted by this thing. Or sometimes it's actually, an individual that didn't realize that these 5 things that were annoying them in different days of the week are actually all connected. And again, there's no, particularly right or wrong answer to this. We're just looking for patterns, right? We're pulling things together and saying, hey, maybe these things are related. Because when we start seeing groupings of symptoms rather than individual symptoms, well, now we might be more willing to jump on and say, yeah, actually, if we can try and solve these things, that's going to be really, really powerful for us. And so as you can see here from this kind of image, let's say, the symptoms on screen is, I've highlighted a bunch in pink and said these might be related, and I've pulled them together. But this is a hypothesis. I don't actually know if these things are related. I'm hypothesizing that they might be. And then we're going to move a little bit further down the track and figure out, how do we check if I'm correct about that, which we'll talk about more in a little while. But if we're going to get to building that hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, another thing we have to do is beat this next killer of change, which is habituation. So this image that I created here, I love it. I got AI to make it for me, but it's one of my favorites because I always imagine coming in on like the first day of a new job into this office and seeing this giant dinosaur and turning to someone and saying, like, what's the deal with the giant dinosaur? And everyone just looks at you puzzled. It's like, what do you mean? That's just Gerald. He's always been here. And you'd be like, what? What do you mean? Like, there's not meant to be a dinosaur in the office. Oh yeah, I guess. Now you mention it, it's a bit weird, isn't it? And I know it's a bit of a dumb analogy, but that genuinely is how it feels sometimes, right? When you are new in a team or an organization and you see things that just seem silly, but people are so used to them that they've just stopped noticing, right? That's the problem of habituation. And that's why this next step of dysfunction mapping can be helpful, right? Yeah, we've always done it like that, David says. How many times have we heard that? And so this next step, dysfunction, is where we essentially try to explain why we think these symptoms might be happening, this relationship between the problems that we're observing and potentially a missing practice, something that we are not doing or could be doing that might solve the problem. And in particular, this is useful because we can start looking external to ourselves, right? So for example, if we're a Scrum team, we could start looking at the rules of Scrum. And here you can see as an example, the team has low confidence in releases. They often are raising lots of bugs and work is being rejected. And we can see this team does not have a definition of done. Those things feel related. And in particular, the reason this helps with habituation is because even just reminding the team or remembering as a group that Scrum, that we supposedly use as a framework, tells us we should have a definition of done, and we've just not been doing that. It's a reminder, right? It's no longer me saying, hey, I think you should have a definition of done. It's this external thing that we said that we wanted to do, that we agreed to, that we've not been doing. And maybe that's why we're having some of these negative outcomes. And so it, again, starts to further build that buy-in as people start to realize, hey, here's something we could do differently, an experiment we could run, let's call it. And again, I'm going to say this a lot throughout, but there's no right or wrong. This isn't about saying this thing does cause these problems. This is about hypothesis that we can test. And we're going to get closer to that as we go. So the thing I should also add at this point, because, for the sake of simplicity, I do talk about Scrum a lot in this example, in the workshop that I run. Mostly that's just because it's easy, because like most agile people, they know Scrum relatively well. We can kind of agree on what those rules are. But this doesn't have to be about Scrum, right? You don't have to use dysfunction mapping in a Scrum or even in an agile context. I'm using it now in lots of interesting places. The point more generally is that there are practices that exist out there in the world that have been designed to solve problems. And any time that we are seeing negative outcomes that we want to avoid, we can look to those practices as principles, those values as experiments, things that we could pull in to maybe solve those problems. And any time that a lack of a practice, a lack of a principle is causing negative outcomes, that's what we would term a dysfunction. So it's not a judgment about things we should have been doing. It's a note that, hey, our system isn't functioning perfectly. Maybe this thing over here is the solution to that problem. Let's try it and see what happens. If nothing else, these are good conversation starters. And you can see on the left there as well, I've got another deck of cards for this, the Scrum dysfunction deck. Turns out, if you're like me, if you've got no life and you spend an entire evening just sitting and reading through the Scrum guide and writing down every single rule and practice and thing that it tells you about, you can create 88 dysfunction cards just from the 13-page Scrum guide. So hopefully that kind of illustrates just how much knowledge and information there is potentially out there, looking much further than Scrum. So it's never going to be a case that we can do everything. These are just things that we can look to, ideas that we can lean on. Cool. So that takes us on then to our next killer of change, the lack of direction, right? And this is one that sometimes I find misleads people, because what I'm not referring to here when I say direction is it doesn't need to be someone telling us where to go and saying, hey, you should go that way. When I talk about a lack of direction, I'm talking more about this idea of, do we actually all understand which direction we're heading in, and are we all heading in that direction? Because it's actually no good if we all think we're on the same page and we're all saying, yeah, let's have a definition of done. But if we're all actually doing it for different reasons and because we're trying to solve different problems, we're then going to pull in different directions and probably not get the outcome that we wanted to get from that practice. And so the thing that we really need to do is align to purpose, right? What are we trying to do here? And so the next step of dysfunction mapping, as you probably guessed, is purpose. Why should we care? right? Team has no definition of done. Well, the trap we could fall into is saying, well, we should have a definition of done because the Scrum Guide says so. Spoiler alert, that doesn't work. No one's ever going to come along with you on that journey. So the question is, well, why does the Scrum Guide say that? What's the benefit of a definition of done? And you can see a couple of examples on there, right? Well, we want to put quality first and maintain standards. We want to prevent technical debt from becoming an existential problem. The idea here is to have a conversation with our team, with our stakeholders, our customers, whoever it is, and make sure that we get on the same page about why we want to solve this problem so that we can all pull in the right direction. And in particular, it's going to help us to figure out, well, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to solve this problem? Which, again, we're going to get to in a sec. But the other thing that this really helps with, for me personally at least, is this forces me to make sure that I step back and understand, because I sometimes fall into that trap of thinking, well, we should do this because the Scrum Guide says so. I'm not really saying that, but I haven't properly thought about why this matters. And then I end up making mistakes and trying to solve the wrong problem. And so this is our chance to just really take a minute and say, right, why does this practice, this principle, this value, why does it exist? Why should we care? And are we all on the same page about that thing? And if we are, cool. Now we can start figuring out what we're going to do to move in that direction. Which leads us to change fatigue. I know this came up a bunch, really common, right? And so again, in my experience, usually change fatigue is the result of people having been forced through really big, broad change plans that didn't have the outcomes that they wanted. And now they're just sick and tired of it, right? They don't want a new operating model. They don't want a restructure. They certainly don't want another coach coming in and telling them how to do their job. And so, how do we beat change fatigue? Well, for me, it's just about making things small, right? Because if we're trying to ask people to change everything at once, yeah, of course they're going to be tired of that. That never works, right? So instead, what we do with dysfunction mapping is try to figure out, given our purpose, our thing that we just agreed that we care about, what's a really small step that we could take in the direction of that purpose? Again, not trying to implement Scrum, not trying to make us look like the textbook. What's a step we can take in the right direction? So it's not boiling the ocean, it's not changing the world. And generally what this means is it's a lot easier to bring people along on the journey with us because we're not asking them to move a mile, we're asking them to move an inch. You can see some of the examples here, right? They're really, really simple. Sometimes it's playing a game. Sometimes it's facilitating a conversation. So I might not even have a solution. I'm just going to say my solution is get some people to talk about it and brainstorm, and then the solution might emerge. And sometimes this is one I use quite a lot when I'm really at the beginning of a change journey, is just share a video and say, hey, we care about quality. Here's a video about quality. Let's all watch that and see if that sparks an idea or a new way of thinking. And then if this is successful, we can think about the next small step, right? But that's the key, is thinking in a series of small steps and seeing if people will keep on that journey with us. And so this is another step. You can tell I really like cards, right? I like gamifying stuff. The first time I ran the workshop and I didn't have any of these cards, I got to this step and I was like, cool. So now our job is to come up with a solution. And everyone kind of looked at me a bit puzzled and they were like, what do you mean? Or just click our fingers, come up with a solution? And I was like, yeah, actually, it's harder than I make it sound, eh? So here you go. Here's some stuff that might make it a bit easier. It's never going to be easy. But the thing I've tried to do here with these cards is create what I call the solution deck. And you can see there's things on here like values, like elements of Scrum, like the events and artifacts, pillars of empiricism, mechanisms like expert, specialist, or pairing. Really all we're doing with these is we're looking at our purpose, our thing that we defined that we care about, and we're pulling a card and saying, could this thing give us a path towards better? Could it help us with an experiment that we could run? And the cool thing about this is I've now run this workshop with lots of people, hundreds of people have done it, and almost always they think that this is a really, really hard thing to do. And then as soon as they draw a card, within 10 minutes, they've got an idea of an experiment that they could run. And you can do that 3 times and come up with 3 experiments. And now you've got options, right? Now you've got stuff you can try. So the whole point of this is just more quickly getting to that idea of what's an experiment I can run. Doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to solve everything, but just a little step in the right direction. Could I facilitate a conversation? Could I improve transparency? Would that help move us towards that purpose? And sometimes the answer is no, but you'll learn by doing, right? That's the point of experiments. So that leads us finally to probably the big one, right? This is the one that's going to be, I think, the hardest in a lot of people's minds, is insufficient evidence, which I know, again, came up when I asked the question of what makes things hard. And usually I find this is the hardest part of what we do as coaches, as Scrum Masters, as change agents. And if you ask 10 coaches, how do you measure success? How do you measure a successful agile team or change? You will get at least 10 different answers. You might get a few people agreeing that velocity sucks. So, progress, I guess. But what you're not going to get is, oh, here's the stuff you should measure. And of course, right? Because it varies depending on context. It varies on the problem you're trying to solve. There's never going to be a single correct measure for every team in every context. But then how do you figure out what to measure? That's a really hard question. Well, kind of the trick that I've played on people by going through this process with dysfunction mapping, by doing all of the heavy thinking up front, by connecting things in this way, you've actually taken something that's normally really, really hard, figuring out, well, what do we measure? And you've made it really quite simple because, well, you just have to go back to the beginning, to those symptoms that started this whole chain of thought and say, how would I measure if those symptoms went away? Because that's my hypothesis, right? I'm going to take this action. It's going to fulfill this purpose. It'll maybe solve the dysfunction. And if it does, I should expect to see those symptoms start to lessen or to disappear. So I just need to figure out how to measure those symptoms. So now all of that stuff that's usually really hard to pull together becomes much, much easier. And so the what do we measure question that's normally really hard has actually now become a lot simpler. And what is still only one part of the question, right? Because the what, okay, that's the symptoms. But the how is still often a bit hard. And you guessed it, another card deck. The measures card deck, I should say. So the measures deck is, again, just me trying to collect up some ideas, things that I've learned over the years of how you can more quickly get to ways of measuring stuff. And there's a combination of things in here that I call soft and hard measures, because I find sometimes hard measures, really, really robust data, lead time, cycle time, predictability, those are really, really cool. And you should use them when you can get them. But sometimes you can get 80% of the value that you need with just a pen and paper. Simple things like the survey, right? How are we feeling out of 5 on this thing? The daily checklist. I often use this when I'm trying to get teams thinking about sprint goals. It's like just listen in on the daily scrum. Did they talk about sprint goal today? Yes, no, yes. In the beginning, it's going to be a lot of no's. Over time, as we start focusing on value, focusing on goals, maybe I start seeing more yeses, and it's a sign that we've moved in the right direction. The time since, when was the last time we got into a fist fight in the office? Running total, how often do we break things with a release? Really easy things that you can just capture with a pen and paper. And again, the reason this is powerful is because, yeah, one of these things on their own probably isn't going to give you a huge amount of confidence that we're moving in the right way. But if we had 4 or 5 symptoms all attached to a dysfunction, and we've got a measure for each of them, and they all move in the right direction, we can probably be fairly confident that our hypothesis is accurate, right? That we're affecting things in the right direction. And that's what we're looking for, right? It's directional change, not necessarily the most robust Jira dashboards in the world. We just want to know, are we moving in the right direction? And if we can measure stuff, we can get some of that confidence. So that's basically it, right? Like what I've just described is this process of dysfunction mapping. And as you probably have seen, it's slightly confusing because we did go from the right to the left, and I'll wait and see if anyone asks a question about that. But it's really just this idea of building a hypothesis, right? So we're starting from, what are the problems we see? What do we think could be the cause? Why do we care about solving the problem? What are we going to do? And how are we going to measure if we were successful? Really simple, but importantly, it's visible, right? Transparent. It's something we can collaborate around. It's something we can build together. And it then gives us a record of, have we changed things, right? We can note these down, see what happens over time. And one thing I want to make super, super clear, because this is a hard point to get across in a very short session like this, but this is not about right or wrong. So when you're looking at a complex system with lots of interconnected pieces, like this image on the left, you could say, here's what I think the symptoms are. Here's where I think the dysfunction might be. Connect things up, form a hypothesis, take some action, and things might change for the better. But just like the picture on the right, you could have the same people looking at the same system and coming up with completely different connections, but they could still create a real hypothesis that creates a positive change that is measurable, right? Because that's the nature of complex systems. There's no simple one-to-one relationship. This linear view that we've built is just a slice of something much, much more complex. So all we're looking for is a set of connections that gives us enough information that considers the whole system, but then allows us to take that small step. And if we keep doing that, each hypothesis will give us a little bit better insight into how our system's working, which things change when we touch what. And that starts to give us a much, much better idea of how to make positive changes, right? Which is what we're here for. And remember as well, that also means you could be wrong, which is to say your hypothesis could turn out to be completely off base. The things don't change, or they change in the wrong direction. And that's fine as well, because you'll learn something from that. And you'll now have a visual place where you can now have another go at reorganizing things and coming up with a new hypothesis. And in my experience, it usually doesn't take that many goes through for people to start getting a good sense of how to build these hypotheses in a way that's somewhat, not certain, but at least slightly predictable, let's say. So another thing, just to add hopefully a little bit more value, if you were to put this into practice, is, well, now these hypotheses that you've built, you can actually condense them down. And this is what I do, is create little coaching Kanban cards. So you can see this one here says definition of done workshop. And I can put that on my coaching Kanban board, where all of the stuff that I'm doing as a coach is visible, can be prioritized, can be WIP limited, so that I'm not trying to do too much at once. And then in particular, when it's done and I move it into that done column, all of the stuff that's in there is captured. So at any point in the future, when someone says, hey, what have you done recently? What problems have you solved? I can go and pull out one of those Kanban cards and immediately talk about the problems that we saw, the action that we took, and the measurable change that we created, which is a massive step up from that trust me, bro, that I talked about earlier, of actually trying to demonstrate the impacts that you've had as a practitioner, right? Which is really, really powerful, particularly things like job interviews, end of year performance reviews. These can be really, really powerful. So bringing it back to those problems that we were talking about at the beginning, right? And what I'm trying to hopefully help with here is I'm trying to give Agile practitioners a bit more of a structure to learn practically how the theories that we learn in these 2-day workshops actually work when the rubber hits the road, right? What happens when we put this stuff into practice? And hopefully we can get better at being practitioners by going through that. It's framework agnostic. Like I say, I talked about Scrum a lot just because it makes things simple, but you don't have to use Scrum. You can use any framework, any tool, or you can keep it high level and just talk about principles and values if you don't want to get into fixed structures at all. It's entirely up to you. And then, of course, the last one is it gives you a way to show your work, right? To have evidence of the actions you've taken and the impacts that it's had, which is something that I think we as a community just need to get better at providing people so that our value is a little bit harder to argue. And if it doesn't do all those things, at least my hope is it will give you a path to beating those 6 killers of change and help you slightly more easily come up with your plans, come up with your hypotheses, and make things a little bit better for your teams and your organizations. So obviously it is not a silver bullet. It is not going to solve all of your problems. I want to reiterate that it's only as good as the critical thinking you bring to it and the degree to which you collaborate with others. But if you do want to learn more about it, I do offer workshops where we dive into this in detail. So I've actually got 2 workshops now. So the original workshop, Dysfunction Mapping Practitioner, is all about agile practice, teams and organizations trying to get better at delivering, products, that kind of thing. And that has now been run with several hundred people. In fact, there's at least one person on the call I know that's been in this workshop. And I'll let you check with her if you think it was worthwhile later, maybe. The second workshop, thanks, Belinda. The second workshop is Dysfunction Mapping for Leaders. This is actually brand new. I've only run it once so far, but you can see a QR code on screen because actually the first public version of that is happening next week, actually. And that one is all about culture. So it moves away from Agile, and it's about using dysfunction mapping to identify the challenges, the symptoms of dysfunction in organizational culture, and how leaders can create change experiments to help nudge that culture in the right direction. Again, though, they are just workshops. They're not going to suddenly make you amazing at all this stuff, but hopefully they'll give you enough structure that you can go away and practice this stuff and get incrementally better with each experiment that you run, which is what I'm trying to get here. And if you don't want to spend money, because like I said, I don't like doing the sales pitchy stuff, I try to make this as available to people for free as I can. So if you follow my YouTube channel, Honest Agile, I put videos up every now and then explaining some common Agile challenges. And in particular, I've got a video on there about dysfunction mapping. But also there is a Miro template for anyone who uses Miro. If you go to the Miroverse and search for dysfunction mapping, you will find a complete workshop template with digital copies of all of those cards that I mentioned, so a few hundred cards for doing the activities, as well as a guided workshop with an activity for each step that you could run with your team if you want to give this a go. So it's not as robust as the actual full hands-on workshop that I do, which is, an entire day of learning, but it gives you a way to get started and to hopefully try some of this stuff out if that's what you want to do first. Obviously, just visit my website, dysfunctionmapping.com. You can find resources and learn a little bit around it about it from there. And that's basically it, to be honest. So that obviously was a super lightning view of dysfunction mapping. But I guess the thing I want to end off with is this quote from one of my favorite books, which is Turn the Ship Around. David Marquette says, "One of the things that limits our learning is our belief that we already know something." So the thing I found is it is really, really easy to get lost in the noise of a complex system. There's lots of moving pieces. There's lots of things going on. You can solve the wrong problem. You can just misunderstand what's happening, which is why it's really, really important to use an empirical approach in your work as well as what your team is doing. So, what actually happens when we put our theories into practice? When I make this change, what measurable impact does this create and what can I learn from that? And the more you do that, the more effective you'll generally be. And dysfunction mapping is just one way of doing that. I'm trying to teach a method that I've learned, that I've built over the years. It is certainly not the only way. You might already be doing something that looks a bit like this already, and that's great too. I don't care if you use dysfunction mapping. I just want us as a community to get better at this kind of problem solving, and particularly being able to show the outcomes that we've created. So hopefully that's piqued your interest. Obviously, I'd love to hear any questions. If there's anything that anyone wants to explore in more detail, I think we've got a decent chunk of time for that. I'll throw it back to Sathpal if I guess you're going to facilitate the next bit for us. But
absolutely.
Thank you, everybody.
Yep, brilliant. Great stuff. Thanks, Michael. That was really good. Really enjoyed that. Lots of great stuff there, and nice to see how everyone can continue their learning and go a little bit deeper and stuff if they want to through some of your workshops and get access to digital versions of your cards and stuff. So yeah, great stuff. Thank you for that. We've got lots of times, as you say. Happy to take any questions from the group. You could drop them in the chat if you want. We'll pick them out and relay them back if you don't want to unmute and speak, but you're also welcome to do it. It's a relatively good sized group, so we'll facilitate that. Probably best if you put your virtual hand up and we'll lead you in. But as we say, we've got plenty of time, and if we don't fill the remaining time, then we can give everybody some time back. But happy to hand it over to you all. Take some questions. If you do have questions, you could ping them in the chat and prefix them with a Q so I can sift through and pick them out easily enough. But yep, we've got time. So anybody have any initial immediate questions to get us started with a bit of a reflective conversation on what Michael's just covered? Nothing jumping out for anyone.
Hello, I have a question. Sorry, I can't find the raise hand
That's
button
all right.
on my
It's all right.
Zoom
No, you're
today,
first.
so I'm just jumping in and being really rude.
Amy, no, of course you're not. It's great.
Hi,
Go for it.
my name's Amy. I'm a business analyst. I work at the University of Bristol. This is all really interesting. One of the things I'm curious to get your take on is how to bring people along with you on the "this might be wrong" way of thinking. Because the organisation I work in it's a knowledge organisation. We're a learning organisation. We are terrified of being wrong. We work with a lot of academics. They want to be right all the time. And they kind of want to gold plate change quite a lot of the time. And I realise I'm applying sweeping judgments, so forgive me. But yeah, but I really like the reason I love Agile is that sense of I might be wrong and let's just try this. How do you bring people along with you on that journey?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and to be clear, right? You describe it as a sweeping judgment, but I mean it aligns perfectly with what I've seen a million times over, right? It is just generally true. Humans don't cope well with uncertainty, let's say, and we want to try and figure out everything up front. And you could argue that the whole reason that the Agile movement came to be is because people realized actually we need to get better at that idea of just experimenting and iterating. So in terms of the how, right? So I covered it at a super high level, but this first thing around symptom and dysfunction is really where I start to try to beat that, because number one, it's about understanding that actually people don't care if I think what they're doing is wrong. In fact, they probably don't even care if they think that what they're doing, they personally think that what they're doing is wrong, because if it's been working well enough in the recent past, it's fine, right? They're going to often just keep doing what they've been doing. And so the key is about trying to kind of break past. So I often would describe as ripping off the Band-Aid. So we've often put things in place. We've often like smoothed over some of the rough edges of our processes and practices to the point that we've stopped really feeling the pain of them. And what we need to do is kind of make them painful again so that we actually realize, oh, wait a minute, I shouldn't be walking on this broken leg, right? I should be letting it rest. And so that's part of what that grouping activity is about at the beginning, which is something you can do collaboratively, right? This is an activity you can do with your team, with your stakeholders, with the people around you, where you say, right, what are the things that make us miserable, right? What makes me not want to come into work on a Monday? What makes me think about quitting, right? You might even have people that have recently quit that you could get some insights from. By putting that on a board and getting people to group it up and being like, and I've literally done this with teams now where they end up with like 20 stickies that have come from a bunch of different places, and they pull them all together and they're like, oh man, I didn't realize how much we hated timesheets. So we really should do something about that, shouldn't we? So sometimes it's just about pulling it together. And I would say the extra tip there is try not to go in with too much judgment, right? Because it might not be the thing that you thought they were going to come to. And it might well be that they come up with an idea that's, not exactly what you would have thought, but it's directionally it's change and it's an idea. And as long as we can get into that mindset of, cool, we've found something we agree on, let's try and make a change against it. We'll see what comes of that, right? So I don't know if that invites any follow-up questions, or if that answers your question.
Yeah, no follow-up questions, but I think you're right. I'm coming across more and more that we just need to get people to collaborate together, because at the moment the approach tends to be kind of, right, we're going to come and tell you what we think the problem is, and that isn't working very well. But yeah, it's also about getting people to try and take risks as well and think, let's just try something and see if it works. So yeah, if we can get people into that mindset together, we've got a better chance of moving that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just quickly add, because I think that was a good point you made there at the end, which is to get people to want to try the thing, often the thing that they need is a little bit of security that we're not going to try to change the world, that we actually have some boundaries or guardrails in place so that we know if we go off the, too far off the deep end. And so by going through the whole process and eventually getting to measures, if we can get to things like, hey, let's see what happens to our employee engagement scores. Let's see what happens to our multitasking rate, right? And so as long as they know that we're looking for, signs of either it's going well or it's not, often that's another thing that makes people a little bit more comfortable to try something a bit different. So.
Great stuff. Just searching for my mute button. No, thanks for the question, Amy. That was a great start. Any others, folks? Welcome to jump in as Amy did.
So I wouldn't mind,
David,
wouldn't mind jumping in myself if I can.
Is that Mike? Is that you?
It is.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, go for it, please.
So I have a few things. For starters, Michael, great name. Well done. Compliment your parents for me. So there's a couple of things in your slides that I find, well, there's one in particular that I find wrong, but I just wanted to point it out because it frustrates me every time I see it. And it's my opinion, it's not a definitive. Your mindset funnel starts off with a mindset, goes to values, then principles, then practices. Mindset is a emergent property, so I don't understand how it can be more fundamental than values. So it frustrates me every time I see it. I had to raise it, otherwise I'd walk away and I'd shoot myself in the foot. The other comment that I wanted to make to you was those, and I've looked at your mirror board, fantastic, by the way, absolutely brilliant. Those cards are really good as well. And so I was going to say to you, have a chat with Ivo Jakobsen and people there, because they're doing an Essence workbench, which is still in beta. And a lot of these things are coming out, especially from people like Dave Snowden, Nigel Thurlow, et cetera, and I think adding yours in there, I think would be fantastic. But then I've got a question for you, and it's an approach question. So you had the image of the dinosaur, which by the way I love as well. My question is more about when you're in the belly of the dinosaur. So by that I mean, you try and explain to somebody that actually there are times when being waterfall is right. Now you have an organization that's promoting agile. That can be a very difficult sell, but they're so rigid in their approach that everything has to be solved with an agile mindset, that you try and take them out of that, or a Scrum mindset, or a Kanban mindset, whatever it might be, that I find it very difficult to find a really solid approach to say, let's forget about all of this and let's worry about the customer. What do we want to do? We want to make the customer happy, right? It doesn't really matter what approach we have that accomplishes that, as long as it's the most effective and efficient approach that gives our customers value. So how do you help people see that they shouldn't become religious, I suppose, about the approaches that they use.
Yeah, no, so thank you for the insights at the beginning. I think I agree with everything you said, so appreciate it. So in terms of the mindset or the let's say the non-religious approach to things, not that there's necessarily anything wrong with religion, just not in how we do work. I think partly this is what I'm trying to do with the purpose step, and this is something that obviously is a lot easier when we've got more time in the workshop. We spend an entire hour and a half just on this part of the process. But the thing I'm trying to drum into people is the process or the practice, the framework, or the thing that we've identified that may or may not solve a problem is only useful for helping us sort of turn the light on and say, here's a concept for us to talk about. But then what I want people to do is completely eject the framework or the practice and just talk about what is it that that thing gives us. And one of the things we talk about in the workshop is actually trying to bring it up a level to values and principles, right? So what is the value that this supports? What is the principle that it's based on? And so what often happens is, like, for example, sprint goals. Setting a sprint goal is a thing that Scrum says we should do, and we're not doing it. And we could just say, well, therefore, let's set a sprint goal. But what I encourage teams and Scrum Masters in particular to be thinking about is why? Like, why does Scrum have that rule? What's the value that it's trying to get across? It's about commitment. It's about focus, right? So, okay, now we want to say, we'll get into our solution. What's a thing that we could do that would help us move in the direction of focus and commitment that is appropriate to our context? And it may not be a sprint goal, right? I'm even using like Scrum values there, so that might already be a little bit tinged, but the point that I try to make to people is that it's at this point, it's not about making judgments about the solution. It's just about saying, what's the direction we're trying to move in and what's an approach? And honestly, sometimes, and I've actually been in an agile organization as an agile coach running a dysfunction mapping workshop, and someone has said, we need a project manager for this. And I've been like, okay, cool. Like, in this context, given the problem that we've described, given the thing that we're trying to do, and the fact that all the teams are struggling to align, and we've got all these confusing dates and all this other stuff that's going on, that might be the right solution. I'm certainly not going to be the person sticking to my guns and saying, no, we absolutely shouldn't have a project manager. So as long as we're doing it for the right reasons, as long as we've agreed this is the purpose we're trying to achieve, and we believe this is going to move us in the right direction, and we know how we can measure it, cool, let's try having an interim project manager or someone from within one of the teams kind of take on that accountability for a short term and give it a go and see if it helps us, and then inspect and adapt, right? Reflect. So obviously you can see I'm always trying to put some agile thinking back in there. But I guess to your original point, just getting into that mindset of what is a step that we can take in the right direction, regardless of what tool or framework or process we're pulling that from. If it helps us, it helps us. That should be good enough. But it will always come down to the people using the tool, right? So if you enter with a very fixed mindset of we have to do Scrum, the tool's probably not going to help you. But I'm hoping that pragmatic people will use this in a way that makes things better. Less pragmatic people, I hope they don't blame me when things go wrong, I guess. Sorry, I realize that was a very long and winding answer, so let me know if you've got a follow-up or anything.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely spot on. Use a frame of reference when it's applicable, try and abstract when the frame of reference needs to change. And then, as you say, I mean, Dave Snowden, I think, talks about wayfinding, and I think you talk about the same thing. So instead of having a goal, just make sure you're heading in the right direction. So I think spot on. I agree with everything.
Yeah, and just to quickly add, because it's something that I've been meaning to reach out to Dave because I haven't talked to him about it recently, but I suspect that there is a version of my workshop that'll play very nicely with the Hexi kits and that approach of build your own method, right? Which is very much how I think. So something might eventuate from that eventually. So keep an eye out.
I agree. And Essence and Eva work closely with Dave on exactly that. So yeah, have a look at that. Have a
Nice.
chat with that. I'll reach out to you.
Will do. Cool. Yeah, appreciate it, mate. Thank you.
An exciting collaboration in our futures. You heard it here first, folks. Louise, you've got your hand up. Dave, sorry, can I, if you don't mind, because actually David did have his hand up a bit earlier, and I'd forgot to lead him in. Do you want? Was it related to what was going, or you?
Go first. You're probably more interested.
Go for it, Louise.
No, my question was actually how many organisations are actually like this? Because I have to say, I've just left my organisation of over 26 years, and a lot of these things that you talked about, I have been through because I wrote our change framework, which lasted years and years and years and years and years, like 20 years or so. So I'm thinking maybe I've just been too insulated from these other organisations that are just possibly not great. Or are taking agile too two-dimensionally. You know what I mean? They're not seeing, because for me, it's all about what works.
Yeah.
So I've always been, what works, we'll pick and choose, hopefully we don't break anything because some things have to work together. But other than that, you do what works. And I'm still learning. And I've been around agile since the late 90s. So are there a lot of companies out there that are really having dysfunctional issues?
I almost want to do a show of hands and see you, like, who's been recently in an organization that's experienced some of this dysfunction we've been talking about, but we don't have enough cameras necessarily to get a good insight. Yeah, there we go. Multiple from David. Yeah, the reason I got inspired to start talking about this stuff is partly I've got ADHD, and I do tend to move around jobs maybe faster than the average person, so I tend to stay in a place for about a year. And so I maybe have just seen a little bit more variation than people with a equivalent amount of experience of mine. Obviously, there are downsides to that as well. I'm not implying that makes me better or anything. But all the best people in neurodiverse. The thing that I realized when I started talking to people about the mistakes I was making is that people would keep on nodding and saying, yes, I've made the same mistakes. But then when we dive into it, it's like they made the same mistake in response to the same problem that I was trying to deal with. So it's like, wow, these patterns just keep repeating, right, everywhere you go. And I think there's really interesting reasons for that. And there's a lot of theory we probably don't need to go into. But I think at the core of it, it's that humans are a bit rubbish at understanding or thinking about a big system. And so we tend to shrink down and think about a small thing, and then we local optimize instead of system optimize. And then the result of that tends to be repeatable, right? And so that's, there's lots of people on here that are going to know this already, and I'm stating the obvious, but the tool that I've created is essentially a way of tricking people into systems thinking, right? It's about thinking big and then bringing it down rather than vice versa. So I guess in answer to your question, in my experience, yes, it feels like this is just stuff that keeps on happening. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we often don't think about the big picture, which is what I'm trying to kind of help people get a little bit better at, let's say.
Okay, thank you.
And if anyone wants to disagree and say that actually they think that maybe I've just had bad luck, I'd love to hear that side of the argument as well.
I think when you've been in several different sectors and worked in lots of different organizations, you do see, various flavors of dysfunction. I think it's hard to avoid, to be honest. I haven't often worked in an organization that had some level of dysfunction somewhere within its context. So I think it's the norm, to be honest.
Yeah, the thing I would quickly add to that is because I say this in my workshop sometimes is, if you think you're in an organization that is not dysfunctional, you're in the most dysfunctional organization of all, because there's no such thing as a perfect system, right? There's always
just become immune to it.
Yeah, exactly. So just something to think about.
Yeah, fair enough. David?
Yeah, I was going to say, of course, you've got a bias there because your CV would suggest that you're the sort of person who gets pulled into companies with problems, right? So, of course, you're going to see companies with problems. That's who you're selling yourself to. But that's not to say that I don't think your observation is true, because I 100% think it's true. I just think you're guaranteed to see it because you go in as a problem solver. So you said somebody should ask you this, so I will ask you. Why does it go right to left instead of left to right?
That is a very good question, and I always like to be I like to be the tip. Yeah, but I am going to do the coach thing because I always like it on this question. Is I would love to throw it back and say, given what I've said so far, do you have any thoughts as to why you think I might make it go right to left?
I mean, honestly, I've had to implement systems that present stuff right to left. So and bottom to top as well, if you look at some very old scrolls. So I don't really have any thoughts because I just see it as a different way of presenting it. However, I do like the fact that sort of the solutions and metrics are prioritized over the problems. So maybe that's what you had in mind.
Yeah, pretty much. So there's kind of two things. And so one of them is just me being, again, maybe it's a neurodiversity thing, but I do this thing that I call introducing deliberate friction to the approach, which is this part that I've just talked to you about, this idea of forming up your initial hypothesis. That's actually the least important bit. That's where you're going to spend the least amount of your time. Most of your time should be spent then doing the stuff, talking with people, observing the system, at which point you read it from left to right. And so what I've tried to do is just make the first bit a little bit more difficult to remind you that that's not where all your time should be, and you should focus on the other bits. And then that kind of leads to your point, which is, yeah, it's about then saying, well, what you're actually going to be paying attention to is what's the measure that I'm looking for? What am I actually trying to keep an eye on here? And what's the action that I'm taking? And then down the line, we expect that to potentially affect those symptoms. But, you know, you really want to be focusing on the change that you're hoping to have. So the other thing I just throw in to add is I do want people to approach this as a critical thinking exercise. So I don't want you to just follow exactly the way I've described it to you today. You can tweak it for your context. So by making it a little bit strange and backwards for you, that might be your first candidate for something to change. And then you might find that changing other things becomes a bit easier for you, right? So a few things mixed in there. Pick the one you like most, I guess.
I think I'm going to start doing my class lectures backwards so that the students thinking of the solutions before they come up with the problems. Maybe that will get them critical thinking, because God knows telling them to critically think doesn't. Anyway,
exactly.
Yeah,
no, I appreciate that. And to be fair, it reminds me, I've had this conversation a bunch recently. Al Shalloway, for anyone that knows him, great guy, talks about a lot of really good and interesting topics, has a lot of criticisms of things like Scrum. And my thinking on the matter is that Scrum is just a victim of his own success, right? The majority of people are now trying to do Scrum. The majority of people don't think critically because they've not been trained, or, you know, all sorts of reasons. And so Scrum often fails. Amplio, which is his alternative so far, is having great success, but not that many people are using it. And I suspect that if he, and I hope he does have great success with it, eventually he's going to be blaming people for not thinking critically in just the way that he, you know, would not agree with now. So I'm trying to be as fair to Al as I possibly can. He's a friend of mine. He's a good guy. So I don't mean him any ill will. I'm just, you know, using that as an example. But again, just something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, death of agile could actually just refer to a death of critical thinking, right?
Yeah, and funnily enough, I actually had a LinkedIn post I was going to do on that, and I decided I might get in too much trouble for it, so I deleted it. But
you wouldn't get in trouble for it, but you'd provoke some conversation.
Yeah,
No.
well, I guess I've had a lot of thought-provoking posts recently, and so I do feel the need sometimes to chill out and stop annoying people. So
yeah, I hear you. Great. Okay. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we've got maybe time for a few more, and if there's no more, then we can start wrapping up. But happy to open it back up to the floor. Any other queries? I didn't see anything in the chat. Nobody dropped anything in the chat, did they?
doesn't look like it.
No, I don't think so. Okay, great. Yeah. So
I'll do
anything else
one.
from anyone?
I'll do another one. And this is a nitpicky one, but why do you call it solution as opposed to test or hypothesis?
Partly it was just the first word that came to mind, and I try not to overthink these things, and then they just stay. When I do the workshop, though, one of the things I do say to people is that, you know, it says solution because I wanted it to be one word, but you should definitely be thinking of it as solution hypothesis. It's here's something I think is going to move us towards the purpose, and then obviously the measure is how we test it. So again, I'm kind of the mind that if the one word that's written there is enough to stop you from getting it right, then probably changing that word isn't going to change the outcome either. So I just kind of trust that people are going to use their brains, and we'll see how many people prove me wrong.
Words matter though, right? So
yeah, it's absolutely, and it's something that I might actually tweak at some point in the future. But
I kind of like test, because test and measure to me go quite nicely together.
Yeah, exactly.
And
the reason. Go on, sorry.
Sorry, test is non-declarative, so it's not this is the solution. It is a test.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I think through it, that one of the reasons that was the language I went with is because one of the problems I was trying to solve, and I'm still trying to solve really, is I find a lot of agile practitioners stay up in the very, very high theoretical level and never actually come down to what am I actually going to do. And so the thing that I talk about it in the workshop is like, make it concrete, right? It's an action, it's a verb, it's a thing that I'm actually going to do that I believe is going to have an impact. And so the solution should not be we should limit work in progress. It should be I can run a workshop on work in progress limits, or I can have a conversation with some people about why work in progress limits are maybe a problem for us, or it's about trying to drive it to action. So I felt solution was maybe a stronger word, but I think your point is valid in that it could equally kind of mislead. So I'm not sure. These are all things that may well be tweaked. So it's just stuff I'm thinking about.
It's interesting because BDD, TDD, these are all test driven, test first, very concrete. If you have a user story which is solutionizing, then a test is more concrete than that. So maybe there's a different way of exerting my neurodiversity over your neurodiversity, Michael.
Yeah, to be fair, I am also autistic, so there's a lot of factors at play when I'm thinking through these sorts of problems, but that's maybe a whole other discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers, mate.
Nice one. Thanks for the further question, Mike. Anything else, anyone? From anyone? No. Sounds like you might be off the hook, Michael. It's good to say.
Well,
it means you've admirably answered all questions that did come up, and there's nothing else that anybody's deeply troubled by or upset by. So that's not a bad place to find yourself with 15 minutes to go.
Someone's just noticed I was drinking cherry Pepsi as well, so good eye. The thing I was going to add, though, before you wrap it up then is, please, if anyone's got a question that they didn't want to ask, feel free to reach out to me separately. We can talk one-on-one, that kind of thing. Find me on LinkedIn. If you've got a question that you're worried might be stupid and you don't want to say it out loud, I would encourage you to say it anyway, because I'm not a person that believes there are no stupid questions. I just believe that the stupid questions are the best questions. So I always love to dive into that because those are the only questions that seem to pop into my head personally. So happy to talk about anything that you think might be a silly conversation, but they're always a lot of fun. Otherwise, yeah, obviously we can talk offline.
Good stuff. No, thank you for that.
Michael, I've got one question for you, if I can.
Yeah.
Did you ever had a workshop like this function mapping with Scrum Masters together with their leaders? So on management level.
So I guess there's a problem there is that I often don't ask, so I don't really necessarily know the relationships between the people in the room. So I try to keep myself out of it, because obviously Belinda asking a slightly loaded question, because I've done some work with Rabobank, which is where Belinda works, and I understand that you have some kind of leadership relationship with some of the people in that room, but I actually don't fully comprehend what that is, and I've deliberately not really thought about it. So I don't know if you wanted to share your insights on your thoughts, but other than that, I wouldn't really know, to be honest.
If there were leaders within the workshops that we had together, no, they were all
all Scrum Masters. So yeah, so probably not like
our also some of the Scrum Masters didn't want their leaders into the workshop.
Yeah, it's hard. Partly I think just because, like, I'm trying to figure out how to frame it. I really try not to treat Scrum Masters as if they're not leaders, right? So it's all built such that I'm just assuming that you are a leader if you're a Scrum Master, and therefore you could be a leader or a Scrum Master or both, and it wouldn't really matter for the workshop. But like I say, I deliberately kind of try to stay away from, what's your explicit role and your relationship with people in the room, and try to keep everyone equal. So I probably have had workshops where there are leaders in the room. I've just not paid close enough attention to that fact that I would have really taken much from it. So I don't know if I should or not. Now I'm second guessing myself, but yeah, I guess.
No, because in the beginning, when you ask the question, what is holding your back, and that's the organizational culture. And one of the things is that we don't only would like to changes within the team, but we also would like to change. We also would like changes within the organization or department itself. That requires some sponsorship, I think, from leadership and
Yeah.
a better understanding in the world that we are in and what we are trying to achieve.
Yeah, one of the things I guess I like to talk about generally, even if it doesn't come up, right, is like at some point you're going to start uncovering patterns that lead to places that are outside your immediate sphere of control, and inevitably you get to leadership and culture, which, to be fair, I think is one of the reasons I've now got the second workshop that's all about leadership and culture. But the way I try to think about it is you're never going to have complete control of the things you need to change. So if you can at least make it visible and identify who you need to influence, you're halfway there, right? So yeah, it hasn't come out directly from a workshop yet, but I'm sure I must have influenced at least some of those conversations. I hope so, at least.
At least on our side, they are curious on what we are about and what we are doing and what we did with dysfunction mapping. Yeah, and some of our Scrum Masters even created a map that they discussed with their tech leads as well. So that was interesting as well. Yeah.
Yeah. We might have to touch base again soon then and talk about what's happened since I was there.
I will be there next week.
Yeah, right. Cool.
So,
looking forward to it.
Michael, is there somewhere where we can find a workshop outline for the new leadership course?
Yes, I don't have it online anywhere, but I've got one written up that I can send to you potentially. So if you feel free to like ping me and I can email it or something like that.
And I suggest putting it in a LinkedIn post as well, because I think it might be worth advertising.
Yeah, I think mainly I was just waiting until after next week when I've done the first. So I've done it once privately and I'm doing it once publicly. Then I think I'll have a better handle of exactly how I want to frame it, because I'm still kind of learning from that experience myself, right? So that's all I was waiting for. So I will do a public post about it after next week, essentially.
Thank you.
Sounds good. I think we're all good. Managed to squeeze in a couple of other late queries there. Yeah, so I've shared link to Michael's profile on LinkedIn if anybody wants to reach out to him, connect directly. It sounded like, Michael, you were okay with that. Any follow-ups? Yeah, as you mentioned yourself, and Mike was suggesting there, I know you're pretty active on LinkedIn, so I'm sure we'll see some further updates and shares and adverts from you about upcoming courses, etc. So that'd be great. Just for everyone's benefit, for those of you who've not been with us before, I've also shared a couple of links to our home on the BCS website and bcs.org, and a link to some of the other sessions that we've hosted over the course of this year and previously. Some good stuff in there. We've already covered the sharing facilitation, Kanban, and a few other things. We recently did a session which kind of did a bit of an intro to LeSS as well. So as you all know, we're agnostic in this particular group, so we'll bring any topics we can to our community, which we think might be of interest and support you in your endeavours to introduce good practices in your organisation, improve your cultures, and ultimately see greater agility. So that's really what we're ultimately all trying to do here in this group. So yeah, with that, I'm going to start bringing it to a close. Firstly, Michael, great to see you again. Thank you for doing this session. It was very informative. We'll get your recording out onto the YouTube channel as quickly as we can. And slides, are you happy to share them? If you are, then if you'd ping them on to me.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
we do that.
Yeah, we'll include them in the post event share, etc. So yeah, we'll get them out for anybody who maybe signed up and couldn't be here. And yeah, great to see you all as well. So thank you all, everyone, for joining and for your participation and your contributions. Look out for what's coming up. We've got a few other things in the pipeline, so we should be able to get those live soon. Again on Eventbrite. So look out for that and look out for our communications. And also, much as we did last year, we have ambitions to do another unconference in person in the BCS London office in September. So we're just doing some planning around that at the moment. So we hope to get that advertised fairly soon. So if that's of interest to you, do look out for that. We had a really good day last year, and a lot of our community got a lot of value out of that who came along and run a whole bunch of different things throughout the day. We'll have some speakers, people you'll know, a lot of interactive sessions within the day as well. So lots of great opportunity to come along, meet other colleagues, get involved, do some hands-on stuff, have great thought-provoking conversations. build your own knowledge, really, and your own understanding, which hopefully you can take back into your organisations and hang out with us on the committee. So, yeah, all good. So, with that, David's raising an eyebrow.
I thought you were trying to spell it, not turn people away.
But no, great to see everyone. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoyed the session, and look forward to hosting you on a future session. So, thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day, whatever you have planned, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.